Greetings all, I'm Aaron Mills, and welcome back to Look Up on the Screen, a retrospective of Superman in cinema. Last time we looked at the first big screen adaptation of The Man of Steel with the 17 cartoons produced by Fleischer Studios and later Famous Studios. However, audiences were still interested in seeing how The Man of Steel would translate to live action. Now, Republic Pictures had tried to make a Superman serial before the cartoons, but they were unable to find a way to make it appear that Superman was convincingly flying, so they let their option expire and the rights reverted back to what was then National Periodicals. Paramount then picked up those rights and created the 17 cartoons through Fleischer Studios and a bunch of other underhanded shenanigans to obtain ownership of that studio and turn it into Famous Studios. But by 1943, they seemed to feel that the series had run its course and let their option expire, which meant the movie rights for Superman were once again up for grabs. Republic had snatched up the rights to Superman almost as soon as he had made his debut in 1938, but visual effects technology wasn't the greatest in the late 30s, and they abandoned the project when they couldn't figure out how to do convincing flying effects. Ironically enough, in 1941, the same year that the Superman cartoons debuted, Republic would wind up solving that problem with a different superhero, the original Captain Marvel from Fawcett Publications. But we'll talk more about him in another episode. When Paramount ceased production on the Superman shorts in 1943, Columbia snapped up the rights and turned the production over to their go-to man for serials, Sam Katzman. Katzman had a reputation for being able to put out a product as quickly and cheaply as possible. Some films he produced had been shot, edited, and scored in 20 days. Legend has it that when a studio executive once commented about needing a picture to tie into the Korean War, Katzman had the movie A Yank in Korea ready for distribution 6 weeks later. When producing a serial, Katzman would often run the stories past his 15-year-old son. If his son could guess how the hero would get out of the cliffhanger for each installment, Katzman would order rewrites. He could be just as stringent in casting. Kirk Alyn, who had been in several Katzman serials beforehand and would eventually be cast as the first live-action Superman, was allegedly required to strip to his briefs so Katzman could check out his physique and make sure he wasn't hiding any extra poundage. Satisfied, Alyn was cast in the role, and in a much less nerve-wracking way, Noel Neill landed the part of Lois Lane. The 15-chapter serial has a very basic plotline. The first 3 episodes are basically setup: the destruction of Krypton, Clark Kent's life growing up, and his eventual arrival in Metropolis. Amusingly enough, he gets a job at the Daily Planet after barging into Perry White's office asking for a job with zero experience, and eventually getting it when he scoops Lois Lane after rescuing her from a mine collapse and then returning to the planet with the story. The plot revolves around the Reducer Ray, a weapon which is apparently more powerful than the atomic bomb, to the point that it can actually destroy a target 2,000 miles away, despite being located in an office in Washington. No, really.
A concrete blockhouse has been built in the western desert, miles from any habitation.
I'd like you to see that test, Superman. The location is here.
That's about 2,000 miles away. I can be there in 30 seconds.
Are you ready, Doctor?
All ready.
Now that you've seen the destructive force of the Reducer Ray, I'll tell you why we asked you to come here. We want you to guard it. You can understand the danger which would threaten the world if it fell into the wrong hands.
I appreciate your confidence in me. All I can say is I accept the trust and its responsibilities.
Thank you, sir.
But underworld crime boss the Spider Lady wants it for herself, and the rest of the story revolves around the various attempts to get it as Superman interferes. As a result, and the need for each episode to end on a cliffhanger, the plot gets kind of convoluted. At first, Superman prevents the theft of the Reducer Ray, but as it turns out, a meteorite made of kryptonite crashes to Earth, forcing Clark to reveal his identity as Superman to the scientist who is examining it. The scientist's assistant, in need of cash, reveals this discovery to the Spider Lady, who kills him and sends her goons to steal a chunk of it, which they do. Then, because the need for a scientist of their own to handle both the kryptonite and the Reducer Ray, the Spider Lady breaks a disgraced scientist, Dr. Hackett, out of jail. Later, they apparently decide to just build their own Reducer Ray rather than steal the existing one and kidnap the scientist who invented it. After several cliffhangers and double crosses, Superman arrives and destroys the Reducer Ray, the resulting explosion causing the Spider Lady to be killed by her own death trap. Oh yeah, and if you're watching this and you think the Spider Lady's chief henchman Driller looks familiar, you probably recognize him from this.
So you really fell in love with the kid? Now look, nobody's going to take you away from me. Nobody.
Not even me. See? I'll kill me before that happens.
So yeah, not a terribly deep story to be honest, but that's to be expected from a serial which was targeted specifically at kids back in the late 40s. There's not a lot of character development, the plot is all over the place, and as I'm sure you've noticed, Katzman's solution to the flying problem was to have the more elaborate effects done in animation, and for what it is, it's pretty good and fits pretty well with the live-action surroundings, even if Superman has to constantly land behind cars and rocks in order to get the footage to sync up. The cast is pretty good. Kirk Alyn does a credible job as both Superman and Clark Kent. Noelle Neal is a lot of fun as Lois Lane, so much so that she would later be asked to return to the role when the George Reeves Superman TV series got picked up for broadcast. More on that later. Carol Foreman vamps it up amazingly as the Spider Lady, and Tommy Bond holds his own as the gormless Jimmy Olsen, even if Jimmy is pretty much useless in the entire story. As simplistic as this story is, it does take a lot of storytelling shortcuts. For example, in this universe, apparently the Daily Planet has just as much law enforcement power as the police.
Superman!
Here's one of the Spider Lady's key men.
Where'd you nab him?
Near Metropolis University. Jimmy Olsen deserves credit for spreading the alarm. He's bringing in the story. Question him, then turn him over to the police.
You bet. Thanks.
I'm pretty sure that's legally kidnapping, especially if you don't turn him over to the police, but expect to question him before you do. But what do I know what the Daily Planet's policies are when you can apparently get a job just by doing this?
What do you want?
A job.
Any special kind, or would mine do?
Well, I'd like to be a reporter. I haven't had any experience in writing, but,
That should help.
well, I have other qualifications that might be valuable.
I told you I wasn't to be disturbed under any... Oh, it's you, Lois.
Yes, this is Lois Lane, Demon Reporter. We're at the mine and there's been a disaster, all right. 10 men are trapped inside the lower shaft, but they won't let anyone inside the police lines.
I can get that mine story. They won't keep me out.
How did you know we were talking about a mine? I didn't mention it.
Well, my hearing is a little better than average. How about giving me a chance?
If you can get inside that mine and bring the story back, the job is yours. You can contact Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen there. They'll be the ones on the outside.
Thanks.
Yeah, Clark Kent, fresh off the train and with no experience, manages to secure a job as a reporter at the Daily Planet almost immediately because he manages to scoop Lois with a story about Superman. But this scene actually brings up something that just recently came to my attention. Namely that, by all journalistic standards and ethics, Clark Kent is a terrible reporter. In the essay, Can the Man of Tomorrow Be the Journalist of Today, by Jason Southworth and Ruth Tallman, the authors make the case that Clark Kent has violated most of the precepts of the Code of Ethics laid down by the Society for Professional Journalists. While this code is not law and isn't a requirement for journalists to follow, most reputable news agencies do, or at the very least have their own ethics code to follow. Southworth and Tallman make the case that by the very nature of putting his life as Superman first and as a reporter second, Clark Kent would be considered a very suspect reporter by any reputable journalist. And while some writers in more recent times have gone out of their way to try to mitigate this, when applied to the 1948 version of Superman, it becomes very hard to disprove their case. Let's break it down. Number 1. Seek truth and report it. While this precept is fairly straightforward, there are a number of clauses associated with it that Superman does routinely violate. Now, I don't have the time to go into all the clauses, but we'll hit the ones that are the most relevant to this discussion. Foremost among these is the clause that states, quote, avoid undercover or other surreptitious methods of gathering information unless traditional open methods will not yield information vital to the public, unquote. Because a majority of the information Clark acquires for his stories is usually a result of him using his powers, in costume or out, this makes his sources suspect because he's able to get his information through channels that aren't available to anyone else. Additionally, because he keeps his identity as Superman a secret, anyone he talks to, even by more traditional journalistic methods, is being deceived. If his interviewees knew they were actually talking to Superman, don't you think they might answer differently, or maybe not at all? Number 2, minimize harm. This is the only one of the 4 precepts of the SPJ's Code of Ethics that Superman does not routinely violate in some way. Superman, in nearly all his incarnations, has gone out of his way to try to minimize the harm done to civilians as a result of his actions, and it's unreasonable and unfair to assume that he's not doing the same thing in his role as a journalist. In my opinion, and it's strictly my opinion, there's no real conflict here. There is, however, in the next precept. Number 3, act independently. As pertaining to Clark Kent, his main violation here is this clause, quote, avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived. Disclose public conflicts, unquote. Clark Kent's entire career in most versions of the Superman mythos, and definitely in the 1948 serial, is based on a conflict of interest. He gets his job reporting on Superman and, in some versions, by getting an alleged interview with Superman. We know no such interview can take place because Clark is Superman. The readers and even the staff of the Daily Planet are being deceived, and Perry White would have a coronary should he ever find out he printed a fabricated story on the front page of his paper. Of course, that's not to say that we can just let Lois Lane off the hook either. In the serial, we see Lois violating another clause of this precept. Quote, be wary of sources offering information for favors or money. Do not pay for access to news. Identify content provided by outside sources, whether paid or not. Unquote. Lois continually pays for information from an underworld informant, and we never see her trying to verify that information. The fact that the informant's information is always accurate is irrelevant in this case. She should be verifying her information and disclosing where it came from. Number 4. Be accountable and transparent. As long as Clark Kent continues to conceal his identity as Superman, it is impossible for him to adhere to this precept. By not disclosing his identity, Clark Kent is not accountable to the public. He cannot honestly answer questions about his sources, his methods for gaining information, or be able to abide by the same standards of honesty and fairness he would expect from those he interviews. His entire secret identity taints the stories he files. He cannot report objectively about Superman because he is Superman, and his stories almost always take the slant of painting Superman as a hero. In one form or another, Clark Kent violates several sections of the SPJ's Code of Ethics, and judging by that metric, he is unfit to be a journalist. But honestly, are these violations any worse than what real-world news organizations do nowadays? The news is becoming increasingly corporatized. Massive conglomerates buy up newspapers, TV stations, and whole news channels, and repeatedly force their mandates on them. When was the last time you saw any sort of news that didn't seem to have a slant on one side or the other? In an ideal world of ethical journalism, we should be able to pick up any newspaper or turn on any news broadcast and be assured the news we are getting is accurate and reliable, regardless of what outlet it comes from. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where we have to constantly do fact-checking for ourselves because we can't trust the reporters who are supposed to do it for us. The line between news and entertainment, reporting and editorials, facts and clickbait is getting blurred more and more every day. In the face of this increasingly complicated journalistic world, do we really have the right to call Clark Kent a bad reporter? Yes, we do. And we also have the right to call the newspapers, the TV personalities, the networks, and the conglomerates they work for bad reporters as well. Ethical journalism is possible, and there are many news outlets who are still striving to maintain those standards. But we as consumers of that news have a responsibility to hold them accountable for violation of those standards. Clark Kent isn't the worst reporter in the world, but he is a symbol of how easily those ethics can be set aside for what may be perceived as a greater goal, whether it's keeping a reducer ray out of the hands of a criminal mastermind or trying to maximize as much profit through outrage and sensationalism as possible. Of course, Clark Kent isn't a real person, and judging his actions by one set of ethical standards is highly reductive. Being a journalist is a means to an end for Clark Kent. By being part of the news media, he's able to get information on major events in the world that may need Superman's intervention. The Daily Planet may pay his bills, but being Superman is Clark's actual full-time job, and given the good he does, I think we may be able to forgive him if his journalistic integrity is somewhat suspect. As for the serial itself, it's simplistic, but fun, although it is the beginning of showing the inherent problem of pitting Superman against gangsters rather than any sort of foe who can really challenge him. which we're going to talk about next time. Because the serial was a hit, Sam Katzman decided to do another serial featuring Superman, one that would pit him against one of his most formidable adversaries and present a new masked menace to Metropolis in Atom Man vs. Superman. I'm Aaron Mills, reminding you to look up on the screen.